Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. Our guest this afternoon, for his second time since he became Prime Minister in December last year, Paul Keating, and he's here with not a little help from our friends at Telecom Australia for what we hope, when John Hewson takes up his standing invitation to come here too, will be a pair of very interesting addresses. Parliament resumes in just under an hour, so to allow the maximum time for our questions and answers, I'll invite you to welcome the Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It's always nice to be back at the Press Club and to be involved again in this debate. When Dr. Hewson addressed you here at the Press Club on the 25th of September last year, he said this: "The fact is, of course, that nobody has actually really tried rational economics properly." The implications of these words were not clear then. The zealot in Dr. Hewson had not entirely emerged. Neither had Fightback. But we've seen both now. We've seen the launch of Fightback and several direct hits scored against it. But it has become clear that for all the holes which have appeared, Fightback has not been allowed to go entirely under. It cannot sink just yet, because in a very real sense, Fightback is just another word for Dr. Hewson. I think that may be why he takes every criticism of his policies as personal abuse. It's a case of "I am the word," and the word is Fightback. The Coalition can't sink Fightback without sinking Dr. Hewson. So unless the Coalition suddenly bites the bullet and sinks its leader, Fightback is going to be still bobbing around at the next election. Fightback is the alternative policy package, the alternative ideology, the alternative Australia. It's only now that Australians are realising what the full implications of Dr. Hewson's Fightback are. Of course, a great many Australians have never accepted the idea of the consumption tax at the centre of Fightback. And it's true that a lot of business people have been uneasy for a long while. His own party have been uneasy. The scrutiny we've subjected it to in the last 6 months has made it, as I said, a pretty lifeless object. But it's ticking. As long as the doctor's around, it's alive. And I think in the last couple of months, more and more people have begun to wake up to the threat of the thing. The nation, I believe, is coming to the rather chilling realisation that Dr. Hewson has no intention of changing his ways, that he's utterly committed to all the policy prescriptions of Fightback. These are not broad objectives, but detailed articles of faith, and collectively they will mean the most radical uprooting of the Australian economy and society in our history. Dr. Hewson's not talking about building on what has been achieved over a century, or even on the higher orders of competition, production and social unity we've developed in the last decade. He's talking about doing it from year one, tearing it down and starting again. That's what I mean about the implications of those words of his last year. Nobody has really tried rational economics properly. Not Thatcher, not Reagan, not Fraser, not Roger Douglas. None of them, you see, went far enough. What does properly mean, if not more pure, a more extreme version of what they did? What does tried mean, if not experimented? Experiments with a theory, experiments with society, with people's lives, experiments with industries. If these experiments fail, too bad, or to use the words of Mr. McLaughlin recently, a tragedy. By the word properly, Dr. Hewson meant economic Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, or the luckiest. This means that the main role for government is to ensure that the price signals are correct, that governments should withdraw. By governing a nation, but governing a nation is not about withdrawing from the important decisions the nation must address. It is fundamentally about knowing how to act to bring about genuine lasting change. Dr Hewson claims that his Fightback package will change the Australian economy and Australian society for the better. This cannot in any way be true. At its heart, Fightback is essentially a switch in the tax base from income to expenditure, and a clumsy, regressive one at that. It's a tax switch which lifts the tax burden on low and middle income earners to benefit higher income earners. It claims to reduce the tax burden on employment by abolishing payroll tax, but then substitutes for payroll tax a much heavier tax on employment. And that, of course, is a much larger goods and services tax on the value added by labour at each step in the productive chain. But Fightback is about more than a tax switch. It also contains policies on tariffs, industrial relations, cuts in government outlays and health, amongst other things. Zero tariffs is simply a textbook objective that is not grounded in the real world or the real problems faced by particular industries. And the debate of the last week has more than established that. It is naive and it is destructive. The Liberals' industrial relations policy is under attack from large and small companies alike, from one industry group to another. All see it as confrontationist, as uncomprehending of workplace realities. Dr Hewson proposes the destruction of Medicare, the one comprehensive and simple health system Australia has had. And why? Why? For no better reason to improve the incomes of medical practitioners, specialists, private hospitals and the private health insurance industry. A significant proportion of the population would again be underinsured. A significant proportion would again find that they could not afford health services. In quite unequivocal terms, Fightback is bad news for Australia. The entire economy put at risk to deliver one political objective, a 30% marginal income tax rate for most taxpayers. Yet the government will introduce the same 30-cent rate, but no consumption tax. Now let me look in more detail at Dr Hewson's tax switch. At the centre of the Liberals' Fightback is a switch in taxation away from income to reliance on a goods and services tax. This exercise involves shuffling $40 billion in the name of assisting business at considerable cost and disruption. Fightback claims that business will be better off and that every household will be better off. Dr Hewson wants us to imagine that business can take its slice without reducing the amount available to households. It's magic pudding policy. Everybody wins, where of course it is impossible to have a position where everybody wins. Dr Hewson claims that taxes on business would be cut by $20 billion. But the revenue collected from the goods and services tax cannot be used both to improve the profitability of businesses to the tune of $20 billion and to pass on the benefits to consumers in the form of lower prices. Without the extra profitability, where is the benefit to business? Without the lower prices, where is the benefit to consumers? If businesses were able to enjoy the $20 billion, that is, if his claim were true and it was a real benefit of $20 billion to business, the inflation effect would be not 5 to 6%, but much closer to the full 15%. That is, the public households would pay the full cost as $20 billion was transferred over to business, and the price effects would be nearer to 15%. A moment's thought should convince anyone that rearranging taxes cannot make everybody better off. I mean, you don't have to be a political or an economic genius to know that rearranging the tax base can't make everybody better off. But it can make for winners and losers. And with Dr Hewson's GST, there would be a massive redistribution of income away from average families to the wealthy. Treasury has shown that 70% of households would be made worse off to fund large gains for the rich. For example, a family with children and both partners working and earning $25,000 each would be up to $25 a week worse off. On the other hand, if that family's combined income were over $90,000, they would find themselves up to $105 a week or up to $5,460 a year better off. That's what we call a fair go Hewson style, incentive Hewson style. The higher income people get the biggest benefit. It's the same story with industrial relations. Everyone agrees that we need to improve the responsiveness of the workplace. Indeed, this government has worked with employers and unions to achieve just this. The results have been coming through with agreements like those at Sheraton, Email, Toyota, Concrete Constructions, and so on. But the Coalition's textbook offers the Darwinian prescription: more strength to the strong. There's no doubt that those in a strong bargaining position in the labour market would benefit from such a free-for-all, but most would lose. The safety net for low-income earners would be ripped away. Those with long-established and firm links with the labour market would lose out. Women would number heavily among the losers. So too would young people. Business would lose from a renewal of the discord and uncertainty that was crippling industry a decade ago. The opposition says that jobs will be created because Fightback is pro-business. But are industrial conflict, high interest rates or higher inflation pro-business? Fightback is a massive and disruptive accounting exercise for little worthwhile purpose. According to the estimates in Fightback, the GST would bring in $27 billion, which I hasten to add is just over half what the income tax brings in, the total income tax of Australia. Although Fightback involves quite a few minor changes, this money, in essence, is used for four purposes which add up to $26 billion. First, compensation for the impact of the GST on pensions, family allowances and the states amounts to about $4 billion. So there's $4 billion simply to compensate for the effect of it. Second, the GST replaces the wholesale sales tax at a cost of $9 billion. So we've taken one indirect tax off and put on another. Third, payroll taxes are abolished at a cost of $6 billion. And finally, petrol excise is abolished at a cost of $7 billion. In total, $26 billion. That is, of the $27 billion raised by Fightback, $26 billion is shelled out in abolishing the wholesale sales tax, abolishing the payroll tax, making cheaper petrol cheaper, and a compensation package which wouldn't need to be there if the GST didn't exist. So we've got this huge accounting exercise, this disruptive exercise in the economy, where $27 billion is raised by taxing food, clothing and services right across the economy, and $26 billion of the 27 is then given back, leaving just $1 billion to fund $13 billion worth of tax cuts. And of course, the rest of the tax cut money is funded by ripping social payments to pieces. Essentially, we have a new tax to be paid by business to replace some existing taxes. This is Dr. Hewson's great bargain. This is the prescription for the new order. He likes to focus on the 7 taxes that would be removed by sweetening the pill. But let's quickly have a look at the rationale for these. 4 of the taxes, the training guarantee levy, the coal export levy, which has already been abolished, customs duty, and the tax on lump sum superannuation, would only have a limited impact on revenues and indeed on cost of business. They are relatively minor issues in costs. The remaining 3 are more significant elements of our tax system. However, the supposed advantages of the GST are illusory. First, the wholesale sales tax. No tax is perfect, and this one isn't either. But the WST, the wholesale sales tax, has distinct advantages over the goods and services tax. The wholesale sales tax is levied at different rates for different items, which means that the great bulk of basic necessities, fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, clothes, electricity bills and so on, are not taxed. They're tax exempt. Compliance costs of the wholesale sales tax are low, with very few businesses required to pay. Dr. Hewson also says he'll remove the excise on petrol. But this is a sham because it leaves a very large hole in road funding which will have to be made up elsewhere, because at the moment roads are paid for in part the revenue from the excise on fuel. The National Road Transport Commission has estimated that the cost of running Australian roads is around $4.3 billion per annum, while the goods and services tax applied to petrol will raise only $750 million. That is, it raises less than a quarter of the cost of actually funding the road system of Australia. This leaves an amount equivalent to 18 cents per litre of petrol that has to be raised from Australian motorists. But he says he won't raise it as petrol. So where does it come from? A tax on kilometres travelled would be akin to a petrol excise, so if he makes it distance, it's the same virtually as a petrol excise, without providing any incentives for fuel efficiency, and higher registration charges would have to be very high and extend to trucks and to passenger cars. And as I said in the House yesterday, this could be up to $17,000 registration fee for a truck, or for very large trucks as high as $35,000 a year. All in all, the abolition of petrol excise is a poor deal, a very poor deal. It's in Fightback largely as a sop to the National Party. But even here, the farmers who already get the diesel fuel rebate get a lousy deal, because they don't pay payroll tax and they'll be slugged twice by the GST, once as collectors and once as consumers. And finally, the payroll tax levied by the states. This is the proposal that probably attracts the most interest from business. But as Professor Freeburn has pointed out, there is little difference between payroll tax and a tax on the value that is added to products by labour. So whether you tax payrolls or individuals in payrolls directly, or tax the value that is added to products by labour, is immaterial. The economic effect of the payroll tax is very like a uniform GST, and substituting one for the other will contribute very little indeed. So in summary, replacing some existing taxes with a goods and services tax is a costly accounting exercise the nation can't afford, and small business would pay dearly. They typically do not benefit from the removal of current taxes because of the very high thresholds which normally apply. Most small businesses don't pay a lot of these taxes, but they would have to keep records to comply with the GST. Overseas studies have found similar taxes to be very regressive, in that compliance costs can be over 250 times greater for small business than for larger businesses. At present, small business doesn't even pay most of the taxes that Fightback promises to abolish. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there are currently 832,000 businesses in Australia. Most of these are small businesses, and almost all will have to fill out their GST forms. But of these, over 700,000 businesses do not pay payroll tax. So 700,000 small businesses and medium-sized don't pay payroll tax. Only 20,000 are required to pay the wholesale sales tax, while perhaps twice this number will be in the WST system in practice. So 800,000 small businesses are destined to become the new tax collectors of Dr. Hewson. They'll all be collecting the GST, they'll all be tabulating the GST, they'll all be remitting the GST, and they'll all spend their weekends doing it. And this is 800,000 of them who now don't pay payroll tax. Ladies and gentlemen, I haven't covered all aspects of Fightback by any means. On so many issues, Fightback represents an enormous step backwards. Women would be particularly hurt, the environment agenda would be pushed back, young Australians, education and training, policies relating to our ethnic communities or to Aboriginals, science, sport and the arts. All of these things suffer under the cuts proposed to public spending to fund Dr. Hewson's proposed tax cuts. And of course these are all issues which require detailed responses in their own right, and my ministers and I will be examining them in detail in the near future. So I'd like to finish on health policy, because it is perhaps this issue that epitomises the blind application of the ideology that underpins Fightback. Australia currently uses about 8% of its resources on health. This is close to the OECD average and well below the figure of the United States, which is 12.8%. That is 12.8% of the total value of the US economy is spent on health. In Australia, it's 8%. This is close to, as I said, the OECD average. With these resources, we're able to provide a first-rate health system. So we're 2/3 of the United States costs, first-class health system. Medicare provides quality care based on the principles of efficiency and access for all Australians. As with any large system, it benefits from the sort of periodic review and refinement that we undertook most recently in the budget. It's a system that works and works well. The opposition's policies would effectively destroy Medicare. The replacement would be expensive and iniquitous, an alternative introduced in the name of choice and market efficiencies. The provision of health care is not like any other service or good in Dr. Hewson's economic rationalist model. The unrestrained market will not provide effective health services for everyone while keeping costs contained. It just won't happen. In fact, Fightback will see health costs soar. It would largely hand over responsibility for setting health costs to the Australian Medical Association, to the doctors. Dr. Hewson said as much explicitly to the AMA at its council. He told them they could set their own fees. It would do this by first removing incentive for doctors to bulk bill by restricting bulk billing to health card holders only. At present, about 70% of all GP services are bulk billed, and that is, of course, at 85% of the Medicare schedule fee, a practice that is cost-effective to the doctor and to the system as a whole. Moreover, Fightback would allow gap insurance for costs up to 85% of not the Medicare schedule, but the AMA schedule fee, the schedule set by the doctors themselves. So he's going to let you gap insure to cover the higher cost of doctors' set bills. GPs would have little incentive other than to charge the great majority of their patients the AMA fee. And because the current AMA schedule is some 20 to 30% above the Medicare schedule fees, patients would be obliged to take out private insurance to avoid hefty payments at every trip to the doctor. Without insurance, patients would be paying about half of their medical bills. That is, without insurance, about half the costs of all their medical bills they'd have to pay themselves. And these would be the people who are currently benefiting from free health through bulk billing. The Treasury has estimated that the overall impact on household health bills would be an increase of 22.6%. The higher cost would affect everyone, but the hardest hit would be those least able to afford it. Dr. Hewson would provide some tax credits for private health insurance, but the amount being offered would be less than half basic medical insurance costs. So he throws a bit back, which is half of what it'll cost you to insure yourself, let alone the supplementary cover or gap insurance. Many would simply not be able to privately insure themselves and their families. So we'd end up again with two classes of patients, with doctors returning to the days of taking on charity cases, treating people who are not insured. Fightback's health policies would see us move towards the expensive US system where 35 million Americans have no insurance or access to services. If you turn up to an American hospital and you don't have the Blue Cross card in your pocket, you're out. Sick, sore or sorry, you're out. This is the world Dr. Hewson wants for us. And why does Fightback contemplate such a change? Not to improve national efficiency, not to improve social equity, obviously, not to improve quality of medical services. The change proposed by Dr. Hewson stems from his insistence that market forces be imposed on our medical system. The doctors, the pathologists, the radiologists, the private hospitals all stand to benefit. The low-paid, the frequent users of the system, including women and the elderly, lose. The notion that a good society is measured by the degree to which all are provided with care and necessities of life are simply abandoning. Such a measure would be regarded as soft-hearted and not well placed. Nowhere are the obsessions of Dr. Hewson plainer. Nowhere is Fightback more obviously regressive. This is rational economics properly applied. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the latest instalment in your side of the debate. It's now time for our questions from media members, and with just over 20 minutes before we have to get back to Parliament. First question is from Don Woolford of Australian Associated Press.
Don Woolford, Prime Minister. According to figures released on Friday by the Japanese Embassy, Australian direct investment in Japan amounts to only 0.8% of Australia's total overseas investment. I'd like to ask if you are happy about these figures and if you believe that to any extent at all they are attributable to constraints the Japanese put on our investment, and if so, will you be taking that up in Tokyo next week?
Well, Don, look, it's not on the theme of Fightback, and I preferred it what the question was, but I'm happy to answer it. The issue is that Australia runs a huge trade surplus with Japan, and thank God it does, because one wouldn't know where our balance with payments would be without it. And as well as that, they've been a source of savings and capital to fund our current account deficit and to take large slabs of equity in Australia. And if Australian businesses want market access in Japan, they've got to do the hard grinding work in a culture which is somewhat different to Australia to create that market access. But Australians don't want their leaders needlessly putting off our major trading partner. I noticed Dr. Hewson saying yesterday, I'll stick up for Australia. It's not sticking up for Australia, punching in the nose the country that we enjoy the largest trade surplus. That's not being good to Australia. That's not being loyal to Australian interests. It's being absurd. It's being immature. And I think Australians understand that we've developed an important basis of trade with Japan and that they want that trade relationship treated properly. That's not to say you don't argue for market access. This government's been arguing for it and getting it for a long time, in minerals, in agricultural products, in meat. But Dr. Hewson's been saying we've been letting the Japanese into Australia for investment. Indeed we have. Who else is going to provide the capital? But would he now say that we've done the Japanese a favour, taking hotels off our hands at 600 million, which today are worth 400 million? As he regards that's the sort of favour they should thank us for? I mean, these are all the sort of comments of someone who has basically wanted to be noticed to get himself out of a terrible problem with the National Party, and that is he has a zero tariff on sugar, and he'll wipe out the North Queensland sugar industry. And in the middle of pressure on that, he decided to divert the attention by attacking the Japanese. Well, you notice the Japanese embassy stood its ground now over the weekend and for a couple of days, and they're entitled not to have their position misrepresented. It's doing Australia no favour, behaving immaturely, stamping your foot when you've got a very mature relationship, and I hope to develop that relationship further when I go to Japan. I'm not going for any particular purpose, for any particular initiative, but simply to advance our understanding as trading economies and societies further.
Maxine McHugh.
Maxine McHugh, Prime Minister, ABC Radio Current Affairs. On a similar theme, in the same way that President Bush is drawing international condemnation for decisions such as extending the export enhancement program and the sale of F-15 fighters to Taiwan, at home these same decisions are drawing domestic applause. Do you not think then that perhaps similarly Dr. Hewson might be touching a domestic nerve with his comments about access to Japan?
You mean in the United States or in Japan?
No, I beg your pardon, here.
In Australia. I don't think so. I think Australians are quite wise about these things. They know that Australia's had to trade its way in the world. They know it's been difficult for us, They know we've now made a very large transition. This year, for the first year in our history, we exported more manufactures than we did agricultural exports or mineral exports. They know that this government has made that transition. That is, we've taken Australia from the Stone Age, without making a pun, to the age that is the Hewson-Howard Stone Age, where we basically went backwards in manufactured exports to a stage where we're now seeing manufacturers' exports being greater than rural and mining exports. They know that's all hard tack. They've watched those balance of payments figures now at least for 6 or 7 years, at least since the terms of trade crisis of 1986. And I don't think they take lightly to silly people doing silly things. And Dr. Hewson, going on as he did, needlessly attacking the one market where we enjoyed a huge trade surplus, is no good for him, no good for us, no good for Australia. And I don't think it rings any chords anywhere.
Dennis Grant.
Dennis Grant, Prime Minister from the Seven Network. Pay television, if I might.
Well, what about? Look, you guys have given the GST a sleigh ride for now nearly a year. There's been no real critical analysis of it by the press gallery, and even when the government gets up to critically attack it, we're on to pay television.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Pay television. Pay television, then.
Yeah, I know. It takes some dexterity to shift subjects. I know that.
What is your view of a mandated role for the ABC in pay television? What of your previous position that the ABC should be in the queue like everyone else?
Well, this question is not encouraging me to put Channel 7 in the queue, I can tell you that. These are matters for discussion. The government came up with, I think, a good model for pay television. In the big sweep of events, in the big sweep of subjects, this is not, again, like a GST, a first order subject. It's certainly a subordinate order subject. But that said, we're better to get it right than wrong. And I don't want to see Australia's pay television system shanghaied to an inferior technology. That is, I don't want to see the satellite being the sole delivery system of pay television. And not when we're seeing your sponsor, Telecom, extending its fibre optic network across the country in a milestone investment decision in the 80s, which gives you the capacity to speak back as well as to be spoken to. That's for interactive services. I don't want to see us simply relying on the satellite alone. Now, as far as the ABC is concerned, I think the ABC has a real question to ask itself whether, if it's sidelined as a pay TV operator, it doesn't see its free-to-air charter diminish. And I think that's a very great possibility, and the ABC needs to think about that, and the ABC board needs to think about that.
Stephen Spencer.
Stephen Spencer, Macquarie News, Prime Minister, with thankfully a question about Fightback.
Yeah.
Many of your backbenchers would like to see you announce a 12 to 18-month tariff pause to further underline the differences between you and the opposition you've been making known in recent months. Is that something you're likely to adopt before the next election, or are you determined to stick to your previously announced tariff policy?
Well, we've been the only government that's reduced tariffs in Australia. Tariffs actually went up when Dr. Hewson was advising Mr. Howard. Under the Fraser government, tariffs rose, protection rose. The only governments that have reduced tariff protection in Australia have been Labor governments. The Whitlam government in 1973-74 reduced tariffs by 25%. They then rose under the Fraser government under the advice of Dr. Hewson when he was advising them. This government has studiously and carefully put into place a discussion with Australian business unions to a phased reduction in tariffs. The big program, 88 to 92, was completed on the 1st of July this year, where everything above 15% went to 15. That's every tariff above 15. That's the ones in the 50s and the 60% went to 15, and everything between 15 and 10 went to 10. We're now phasing the 15 and 10 to 5. by 96 and 2000. And for the plan areas, we've got 15% for cars and 25% for certain areas of textile, clothing and footwear. We think we've got it about right. And being serious about it, we're not about to be buffeted by the, again, theoretical prescriptions of Dr. Hewson, who did not seek to join the consensus with the government and adopt the government's tariff policies, its phase downs and endpoints, and say, look, this government's done what we would never have done. It's done something good for Australia. It's taken on a sensible thing that will actually stick. We will maintain the consensus, adopt the government's phase downs and endpoints. No, he has the cheap one up. We'll all go to zero. And we're supposed to say, oh my God, isn't that tough? You know, isn't that strong? Where in truth, it's just silly. It's just silly and it is disruptive, and that's why the motor vehicle industry and other industries are now so put out about it. And well, they might be. The whole city of Adelaide is put at risk by Dr. Hewson's policy. A large part of the state of Victoria is put at risk by Dr. Hewson's policies. And so we've made careful judgments about it in the 1980s and then again in 1991 when we announced the 92, 96, 2000 phase downs. So they're all there, and we think we've got the judgments pretty right.
Kieran McLennan.
Kieran McLennan, Network Radio, Prime Minister. You've spent a lot of your speech bucketing Fightback, though you do admit it will be alive at least until the next election. The Coalition admits that they haven't yet sold Fightback, that it is still causing concern and trepidation in the community. Given that they're not the underdog going into the election and you are, isn't it quite possible that Australians want to take anything except a Keating government for 3 years? And is it also possible that you won't be looking to try selling anything positive to the community until the economy picks up? That's your only strategy on positives.
Well, Kieran, it's only that colour coordination of yours and that wonderful hairdo that sort of encourages me into giving you a very nice reply, because you always put the most charming questions, and that is that I can't see the Australian public being at all attracted to a policy which says we will take $27 billion off you and we'll give $26 billion back, but it'll be largely going to removing other taxes and replacing them. And the result of that is to add 6 to 7 percentage points to inflation, and for all of that they then go and pay for private health insurance, they have their tariffs cut to zero, and they have industrial confrontation. That's basically what Fightback is. It's a crude tax switch which taxes expenditure rather than income, and which basically cuts tariff to zero, which makes people pay for their private health insurance and is generally socially upsetting. Now, contrast that with the government's change over the 80s to a more competitive country. Contrast that with our evolutionary changes, though radical changes to the labour market, with low inflation, with exports rocketing along, with a strong trade surplus and growing. Contrast all that with low inflation in the 90s, and to say give all that up, see the social net destroyed, see Medicare destroyed, see people tipped off unemployment benefits after 9 months, as Dr. Hewson proposes, see the social security program knocked about, see all these things occur. But we're so enamoured of Fightback with its consumption tax that we'll take that. I don't think they will, Kieran. That's the point. And that's why I think that that upon mature reflection, that won't happen. Now, I saw your mother and father over the weekend in Bathurst, and they told me you'd asked me a nice question, and I want to thank you for it.
Lyndall Curtis.
Lyndall Curtis, Radio 2UN 3AW. Mr Keating, from the consumption tax onto Labor's taxes, Was the report in today's Australian correct that you and John Dawkins pulled out details of your tax increases from the budget? If so, was it a bad move considering the scare campaign the opposition's been running against it?
No, well, the story was not correct. The story is not correct. At any rate, it's a bit academic because tomorrow the Treasurer will be making a statement and introducing legislation on this very topic. Now, the fact is, not only was the stories not withdrawn, but they were left explicitly in the budget papers. That is, the measures that the government might consider were actually announced in the budget papers. But the notions that sort of details had been considered by the Revenue Committee and adopted to be then withdrawn was wrong. And I don't know whether Laura's here, but she was told it was wrong, but she still wrote it. Now, one little chink of it's right, but the general thread of the story is not right. That is, the government did announce that it was looking at these things. The Revenue Committee never considered the prescribed payment system or the WST, never. It did consider the FBT, but no decision was taken as to its introduction, leaving that, if it were desirable, to the Prime Minister, myself and the Treasurer. So we then put in the appropriate text saying we'd consider some of these measures and if we thought it necessary at a later stage, adopt them or otherwise, and we have stayed true to form. But you compare that with what Dr Hewson, the sleight of hand, here he is the other day saying, we'll consider in office what is the nature of the charges for motor vehicles. In other words, he has a $4.5 billion set of charges, $4.5 billion set of charges for roads, which he's politely saying he'll consider in office. In other words, and he's also said on the record in September that charges ought to be levied on the basis of mass or distance. So it's either going to come as a registration fee or as a tachometer charge on trucks and on cars. And it's huge. And so the fact of the matter is that he has to be as accountable as we have. But as always, we're always the accountable ones. As I've made the point to you before, it's November last since any of you insisted on him doing a press conference in Canberra. And as a result, he's quite happy to deal with the fire engine chasers and the rest, where he knows there's going to be no follow-up questions. And on this question, there ought to be follow-up questions. That is, who and how will the $4.5 billion be levied and who will pay for it?
Bruce Juddery.
Bruce Juddery, freelance Prime Minister. Prime Minister, you deplore Dr Hewson's penchant for experimentation, or proposals of experimentation. And as I recall, as Treasurer and now as Prime Minister, you committed yourself to an accord with the unions, which effectively has emasculated the government's capacity for intelligently using fiscal policy to manage the economy. You've got yourself locked into a situation up until a year or so ago where all you had going for you was control of interest rates, and we seem to be in a pretty pickle as a result of all that. When did you develop this abhorrence for experimentation, Prime Minister?
Well, Bruce, I mean, occasionally you ask one that goes right over the shoulder. I mean, this one is one of those. I mean, the fact is the government's had total flexibility in policy, right? Let me explain to you. I mean, you write for a business magazine. This will be of interest to your editor. Yeah. Now, these are the points. The first is that fiscal policy was so tight in the 1980s, we produced $20-odd billion worth of surpluses. That gave us the freedom to produce deficits if we needed to, which the United States does not have. The US budget deficit's now sitting at about 6% of GDP, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Mr Greenspan, told an audience in Wyoming 3 weeks ago, fiscal policy in America cannot be used to stimulate the economy. It's run its race. In this country it can be used. It is being used now. Why? Because of what we did in the 1980s. Total flexibility on fiscal policy. On monetary policy, we've had 13 reductions in interest rates since 1990. Total flexibility there. And on wages, flexibility there. We're talking again about another wages system where 3/4 of the people adjusted are not going to be in the centralised system. And yet we're seeing enterprise deals being done with very low costs and low inflation portents about them. So on wages, fiscal and monetary policy, we have flexibility and we're using it. What would Dr Hewson have? He wants no conversation with the unions, no accord, no flexibility on wages. On monetary policy, he would only stick interest rates up because the consumption tax would add to inflation and therefore the inflation effect would obviously climb into interest rates. And on fiscal policy, he'd be left with the same starting points we're left with. That is, if we are contemplating changes to deal with the starting point deficit in 94.5 and 5.6, so is the same problem would apply to him were he to be the government. That is, because revenue declined by $5 billion between June and August this year, that $5 billion declines in the starting point out there at 94.5 and 5.6. If it's a problem for us, it's a similar problem for Dr Hewson. What's he going to do about it? I mean, tomorrow we're going to announce measures which will improve that 95.6. What's he going to announce? Or does he get let off again? Does he get let off again? The no explainer. I mean, or this reply you get from him and Mr Reid, it's in Fightback, read it. As if those of you are deficient and you've not been able to read the thing. The truth is it's not in Fightback and this guy is not accountable and the starting point problems of 94.5 and 5.6 would be just as much his as ours were he to be the government, but he wouldn't have the flexibility on monetary policy and on wages policy that we have because he has no truck with an accord and no agreement with the unions. So the confrontation is simply him saying, we'll kick you off awards, your holiday pay, your rates of pay and conditions will all go, you'll fall out of the system, you've got to make a contract with your employer. So the employee gets a phone call from the manager's office, come in, you've got to make a contract with us. And the person says, well, I'm not making a contract with you, I've got an award, you make a contract or you're out. Now, it's going to produce a lot of confrontation. That's exactly what some of the senior executives of this country have been saying the last 3 weeks. We don't want this confrontation. We're now moving to a harmonious change in our industrial relations system, a productive change to enterprise bargaining. We don't want confrontation now. And that's why Dr Hewson's policies are so out of kilter with what's happening in Australia and the mood of this country at this time and its needs.
Time for one final question from Glenn Milne, please.
Glenn Milne from the Australian Prime Minister. 2 points. One, the first a clarification. Your previous answer on tariff policy, was that a yes or a no? Are you ruling out any change to either the timetabling of tariff reductions under your government or the pause?
Glenn, we've made that clear in the past. Made that clear in the past where we stand. We didn't think about these things quickly or in an opportunist way. They were put together carefully and we announced them carefully, and when a lot of people were not aware of all these issues, the government was doing a lot of careful consultative work with industry and putting those endpoints together, and I was one of them. John Button, myself, others, making sure that the 15 endpoint for cars and could be lived with. We believe they can.
And the second question, you raised doubts in the presentation of Fightback in your speech about the economic value of income tax cuts. Why then did you offer your own income tax cuts as part of the One Nation statement?
What I'm saying is all of this is supposedly to provide income tax cuts. This whole nasty bag of tricks in Fightback is supposedly, the joy is supposed to be a 30% rate at 20,700. All I'm making clear is the government will be doing a 30% rate at 20,700 with no consumption tax. That is, we'll be able to put into place, because of the fiscal policy we've put there, tax cuts without a consumption tax and without such in macroeconomic terms, inflationary disruptive change to the economy. Now, that was always a possibility. And why is it a possibility? Because of the strength of Labor's fiscal policy in the 80s, because of the underlying strength of the outlays. That is, because the outlays were reined in the 80s, we have the fiscal flexibility to do these things. But what then is the point of having a very costly and complicated tax switch, which is going to hurt many Australians, a socially disruptive change to provide the tax cuts that the government itself will provide with no consumption tax? Thank you very much.
Thank you once again, Prime Minister. You have every gift that we've ever been able to bestow on you. So we've brought in something from outside, from the real world of Canberra, the vocal group. I'm told Manhattan transfer with a brass section. They'll also be appearing here at the Press Club here. Yes, Together it's called. So thank you very much once again. Thank you for a tax story, if not a GST story.
Thank you. Thank you.